Almost everybody here probably knows what a compass is for, don't we? It gives us direction. It guides us and keeps us from getting lost. It does this by always consistently pointing north. And this simple instrument made the exploration of the world possible because it gave the explorers their position, their orientation in relation to the North Pole. And having this information allowed them to navigate the globe. This simple instrument was in use for thousands of years, and it has only recently been replaced by GPS technology. But yet the backup system, the navigational backup system for ships, planes, and a lot of other things still remains the humble compass. There's another compass that each one of us uses, though, almost every day. We have been given one, although there are times when we choose to ignore it. It is our moral compass. That part of our psyche we call the conscience. Our conscience directs us and gets our attention when we are about to do something wrong. It helps guide us in finding the right way to go. And just as important, it tries to prevent us from going in the wrong direction. Our moral compass gives us the principles that guide us through life, help us to do what is right and true and good and kind. Though Paul does not refer to it as such, the principle he is communicating is certainly the same. And where do we get this moral compass? Where do these principles come from? How do we acquire and to develop good judgment and the right principles to guide us in right living? Well, Paul is clear. In verse 1, he says it comes from the good example and encouragement that we receive from others of good character. Paul also says in verse 4 that it is from the teaching of Scripture. It is from these two sources that we also learn how to navigate around the things in life that would do us harm or allow us to hurt other people. Paul also cautions his people not to be arrogant or smug, not to treat anyone as less important than anyone else. And he tells them to remember that some are still learning how to follow Christ. They are baby Christians. And we have to give them a little more space. Give them a little more grace. And accept them just as Christ has accepted us. Now, most all of us know how a compass works. The needle points to the north. It does so because of the magnetic field that surrounds the planet, right? Which causes it to actually point to the magnetic North Pole. But for a compass to work properly, you must keep it away from ferrous materials, especially other magnets, or anything else that would adversely influence or disrupt the Earth's magnetic field and cause your compass to point in the wrong direction. Just like a compass, we must be sure that we prevent outside influences like worldly desires or ambition or greed from disrupting our moral compasses. We must also be cautious when we are around people of questionable character, because they can have a negative influence on our otherwise good judgment. There was a study conducted a few years back by MIT, that would be the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, that shed some light on how our brains actually process information, on how we In this study, people were asked to answer questions about situations based on their moral judgment. They were asked questions like, would you let your spouse, for instance, well, let's not use spouse because that can get into other things, right? So let's use child. Would you let your child cross a bridge that you knew to be unsafe? Would you? Of course, the obvious answer is what? No, of course we wouldn't do something like that. However, it was discovered that when the test subjects' brains were subjected to a strong magnetic field, while they were being asked these questions, their answers were suddenly not morally grounded as they probably should be. They made moral judgments based on the outcome of the situation instead of a moral principle. In other words, if the child made it across the bridge safely, they saw nothing wrong with the decision they had made to let them walk across an unsafe bridge in the first place. The researchers concluded that the magnetic field rendered the subjects unable to make solid moral judgments that required an understanding of other people's intentions. The part of the brain responsible for this change, well, it's a cluster of nerve cells right at the base of the brain, I think. It's called the right temporal well, big scientific word here. Right temporal parietal junction. Some medical person might get that better than I did. What took place, though, in the brains of these test subjects is that the magnetic fields they were subjected to temporarily disrupted the cells from working normally in this part of the brain that is thought to control moral judgment. Under the influence of a magnetic field, the test subjects were prone to judge actions solely by whether they caused harm or not, and not by whether they were morally or ethically wrong in themselves. In short, if the situation had a happy outcome, even if arrived at by questionable means, the subject usually agrees that they had made an appropriate decision. Now, there's an old saying I've often heard that speaks to this kind of reasoning, which says this: the ends justify the means. We know that's not always appropriate. Now, this report didn't discuss how they might be able to apply this new kind of technology that they just bumped into. Perhaps someday, though, that they can find a way to use this information to install a device in a person that would cause that part of the brain to work better. Heaven knows that would be quite the finding if we could just tie a magnet on someone's head and increase their moral judgment. Wouldn't that be great? Wouldn't it be great? Why, think of what that would mean. It would mean it would mean that most of us might have to walk around with a magnet strapped to our heads. Huh? Why, it could even have the effect of emptying out our prisons. Of course, the downside of this is that you can always take the magnet off. You could remove it, and I think Paul was aiming for a permanent and positive change in the lives of his readers. Change that comes from within, and not change caused by outside sources or applications. He points to Jesus as our example to follow by reminding them that Jesus Christ did not live to please himself. He took on the messy problems of the people around him and found ways to help them. Should we not also be trying to do the same? Paul also knows to whom he is writing this letter to. These people, they were Gentiles like us. He wasn't writing to the Jewish community, but to the Gentile community who were perhaps not familiar with the scriptures. Most likely they were not. They were not brought up in religious schools and taught these things. And many of them were learning about the Bible for the very first time. So he directs them to read it. These things were written in former days for our instruction, Paul says. I think Paul was clear. Reading the Bible and learning its principles is one of the ways that we develop our moral compasses. Paul reminds them that if they learn the principles contained in Scripture and then do their best to live out those principles in their everyday lives, then they are counted as children of Abraham. Even though they were not, even though they were not Jews, even though they are Gentiles, not actually a descendant of Abraham, God has promised that he will accept them as his children, that they will be adopted into God's family. So instead of strapping a magnet to your head in hopes that it might increase your ability to make good moral decisions, why not spend some time learning the principles contained in Scripture? The first may not work, but the latter is a proven method for improving your moral compass and developing good character. A wise person once pointed out that when it comes to making good moral decisions, the human race is often divided into two camps. When posed with a choice of whether to do something or not, one group will say, well, what's the harm in it? While the other asks, what good will come from it? Now there is a subtle difference here, but think about it. The wise person went on to say that they believe the future of our civilization very likely will rest with those who answer in the second way. It's curious that in the MIT experiment, the stunted moral sense in some of the test subjects expressed itself in terms of the first question. It's curious. But isn't it always easier to ask, what's the harm in it, than it is to ask, what's the good that will come from it? Likewise, I think it is likely much easier for a doctor to be satisfied with doing no harm than to look for the ways to do the most good, as it is for the rest of us. You see, one requires little engagement, while the latter requires compassion, involvement, and investment. I also remember a story I heard once about the great banker, J.P. Morgan. When he was called to testify before a congressional hearing, there was a lawyer who asked him a question. And the lawyer asked him this. He said, what was it that he thought was the most important thing before issuing a line of credit to a commercial enterprise? Property or liquid assets? Morgan replied, neither. The most important thing is character. The lawyer was clearly taken aback. Before money or property, he exclaimed. Yes, before money or property or anything else, Morgan said, because money cannot buy it. And as Paul so clearly points out, it's very important for us to spend time around people of good character. And it's also important for us to find ways to develop our own good character. You see, reading the Bible and learning good moral principles, associating with people of good character. These are some of the best arguments I know of for attending a church, being a member of it, being active in it, participating in its mission and its ministries. So be at church often so you can hang out with some really good people. Be a friend and bring a friend. Remember, your presence is important. Every time you come, the gift of your presence is exactly that. It's a gift to everyone else in attendance. Don't withhold that gift from them. Let's pray. Loving God, we thank you for this season of the year. We thank you for our church, for the people in it, which gives us a place of comfort, support, and learning. Lord, help us to learn the principles that you want to teach to us so that we may be